Good evening. Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm Brian Ballo. I'm a professor in the Department of History at UVA, and I run the National Fellowship Program here at the Miller Center. We're very pleased to have as our speaker today for the forum Tim Grosclose. Tim is the Marvin Hoffenberg Chair of American Politics at UCLA, even though he's only 14 years old. He's written widely on media bias. He's also written influential articles in political science on the legislative process, on committee structure in Congress, and the role of ideology in politics. This evening, Tim is going to be talking about his recent book titled Left Turn: How Liberal Media Bias Distorts the American Mind by St. Martin's Press. Can we all please welcome Tim Grosclose.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you all very much. I must say I'm so pleased to be here as an honor. I have some Virginia roots. It turns out that the very first Grosclose ever to come to America settled in a town, a little rural area in southwest Virginia. It's now called Grosclose, Virginia. And it's a great town. Everything's great about it, except it's very close to Blacksburg. And, I know that may be a sore spot.
Especially this week.
I know. I'm going to talk just about my book. I'm just going to give a quick summary of it, which I think will last something like 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have lots of times for questions. I'm just going to follow the order of the book. There's 4 parts of the book, and I'm going to start off with part 1, Political Quotients and the Science of Politics. By the way, this will take, this is maybe the longest part. It has nothing to do with the media, unfortunately, but it does form the kind of background and the foundation for everything in the book, so it's pretty important. So I start off, this is a picture of my friend Dawson Engler, who is a professor of computer science at Stanford University, an extremely impressive guy. He specializes in operating systems. He has written his own operating system twice. When he was a grad student, he wrote 8 peer-reviewed papers, publications. When I was a grad student, I had 0. I almost had 1, but this guy had 8. This is the type guy that succeeds at anything he tries. When he was in high school, he was 2nd place in the Mr. Teenage Arizona Bodybuilding Championship. So great guy, friend of mine. We're walking along one day, and he says, "Come on, political science isn't really a science." And I think, right, well, he knew I was in political science. What do I say to that? And so I was prepared that when this happened. And I said, well, look, so we can both agree, and as any engineer or mathematician can agree, if you can graph something, you can describe it with an equation. He says, okay, yeah, I agree with that. Okay. And all the time, we're talking about people being left-wing or right-wing. He says, yeah, right. So if you're left-wing or right-wing, that means you can graph them. You can graph their positions. And if you can graph their positions, that means we can describe it with an equation, which means it's science. And he kind of chuckled, maybe smiled. Didn't give me any more grief, but I'm not sure I convinced him, but at least didn't bother me anymore. Turns out when he said that, I was doing precisely some of the political science that I was describing when he made that quip. And here's an example of that. I now call these scores political quotients, but this is what I was working on. This is the conversation happened almost 20 years ago. If you tilt your head to the left, the scores run from right to left, from conservative to liberal. I'll talk more about these in a minute, but these are just some of the work that I was doing at the time. Political quotients is a way of describing precisely, mathematically, quantitatively, the political views of different politicians. Now, I told you I gave you some homework. Everyone should have a sheet of paper. This is 2 pages from my book. This is just a 10-question quiz, which allows you to compute your own political quotient. So this is I call this a 10-question approximation. I also have a 40-question quiz on my website, timgrosclose.com, if you want a more precise version, willing to spend the 15 or 20 minutes on that longer version. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the technical details of these political quotients. Here's one. First is how I compare these things across time. So you all have a list of questions that came from issues in 2009. By the way, these are all congressional roll call votes. Yet, I am allowing you to compare your political quotient to politicians, even politicians such as John F. Kennedy, who weren't alive in 2009. And you say, well, how can I do that? And by the way, also, here's another, I think, one of the most interesting things about the political quotients. According to my research, my results, Joe Lieberman is actually slightly more liberal even than John F. Kennedy by these political quotients. And you should be a little skeptical. How can you do that? You know, these are guys who served in two different eras. Well, to do this, I won't give all the technical details, but just say it's something similar to what a teacher has to do when he or she has two different tests and he wants the two tests to be equally difficult. One way to make them equally difficult is to make all the questions equally difficult. Now, trust me, if you've ever taught, that's hard to do. You really don't know how difficult the questions are until you have students who have answered them. And so another way to do that is just to curve the tests. So after you give the two tests, you look for the one on which lots of people did better or lots of people did worse. You take the one where everyone did worse and you add a certain amount to those scores, okay? You curve the test. So that's one way you can make the tests equally difficult, by curving them. And so when Engler made that quip, the work that I was doing, it was with two co-authors. One is Jim Snyder. He's the person on the right, now a professor of economics and political science at Harvard. And the one on the left was a grad student at MIT named Steve Levitt. Now, anyone heard of Steve Levitt before? This is, if you haven't, I bet you're about to say, oh, I remember. He's the author of Freakonomics. And it turns out this is the time. He was not famous at all. He was just a grad student. I was already a faculty member, but I recognized very early, this is a talented guy. And I predicted within a few months of meeting him, Steve is going to win a Nobel Prize someday. And to pat my own self on the back, I verified that I was the first to predict that. Even Steve's parents weren't predicting that, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be right. The work we did, so this was eventually published in 1999, started in 1994, was just a way to curve those tests. So I have different questions for different roll call votes over different years. So if you treat each year as like a different test, you can curve those tests to make them equally difficult across the years. And the way you curve them is to do something like this. So I have these conversion factors here to convert a 1947 score into a 2009 score. You just subtract 10.2. First, you multiply it by 1.11, then you subtract 10.2 from it. So that paper, all we did is just came up with these conversion scores like that. And so we make the argument, once you do that, then the scores are comparable across time. Here's another technical issue. Why do I get to choose those questions? So you have 10 questions. Also, what do I get to decide? By the way, A is always the liberal answer, B is always the moderate answer, C is always the conservative answer in that 10-question quiz. Why do I get to choose which is liberal, which is conservative? And the answer is I don't. What I've done is I've just used the Americans for Democratic Action. They're a liberal interest group. They've been around since 1947. They're the interest group that political scientists have lots and lots of these roll call-based measures. There's a National Taxpayers Union score, there's a Family Research Council score, there's a National Farmers Union score, there's a National Wheat Farmers, any issue you can imagine, there's a score base. But the one, as far as I'm aware, that's been around the longest is Americans for Democratic Action. It's a liberal group. That's why in my scores, high is always liberal, and it's going to get confusing in a minute because I'm going to put the low numbers on the left and high numbers on the right, and I'm going to talk about the higher numbers being more left-wing, even though they're on the right. But the whole reason is because I'm using Americans for Democratic Action scores. So each year they pick about 20 or so roll call votes in the House and Senate, and I've used those using that conversion factor that I did with Steve Levitt and Jim Snyder, and that's how I make my PQ scores. Okay, another point. I have estimated, we can talk about in the question and answer part how I do this, but I've estimated what is the best guess of the PQ of the average American voter, and by my results it's about 50.4. I did not do these from asking quizzes to lots of voters. Instead, I did that based on it, kind of assuming that the representatives in Congress, on average, are representative of their district, and if so, I can use that to come up with an estimate of the PQ of the average voter. If I'm right, here's what that means, a PQ of about 50.4, and I'm calling that centrist for the rest of the talk. I will call 50.4 is perfectly centrist. It happens to be almost exactly the score that the PQ that Arlen Specter had when he was a Republican in Congress. So lots of Republicans said, oh, he's a rhino, or he's a Republican in name only. I said, well, that's sort of true. I would argue my PQ score showed that he was just barely a Republican. He was right in the middle and almost a Democrat, and eventually did switch to be a Democrat. Some others, Tom Campbell, who's in California, Ben Nelson, the Democratic senator from Nebraska, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, the Republican senators from Maine, basically any Republican from the northeastern states, and lots of the Democrats from kind of the western, southern states are usually have PQs near 50. And finally, Charlie Wilson, so you may remember the movie Charlie Wilson's War. Tom Hanks played Charlie Wilson. Well, Charlie Wilson, according to my PQ scores, is very centrist. Another thing about PQ scores, I can estimate the average score of voters in different regions. And so here's what I've done. I've listed all the states. This is going to be hard to read. But the states, according to my estimates, the average Utah voter has about a 6 PQ score. The average Vermont voter, that's the most liberal state, not counting Washington, D.C. in my sample. Vermont was about an 85 on this scale. The ones in the center, the purple states, as you might guess, the average voters there have about a 50 PQ, and those are states like Iowa, by my estimate, was the most centrist state in the Union. Colorado and Nevada were close second and third. Let's see, just for fun, I looked up Virginia. This is a pretty purple state, slightly red-leaning purple state. By mine, the PQ of the average voter in Virginia, by my estimates, 45. I hope I will pronounce this right. The average voter in Albemarle County. My understanding is that Charlottesville is actually surrounded by Albemarle County, but not actually part of it. I think that's right. Well, that part, the surrounding part, has a PQ of about 57, and the average voter in Charlottesville is pretty liberal, about 101. That's it. Okay, so that is the background, all about PQs. The next thing, part 2 of the book, I want to explain a distortion theory of bias, and this is as opposed to a lying theory of bias. And my point in this book, it took me 8 years of research to do this, and in those 8 years, I hardly ever found a false statement, a statement that I felt was false. So either from the right or from the left, but I think that the main bias, the main part of the bias, comes not from the false statements, but it's from the facts, the true facts and topics that the reporters don't tell us. And so in that part, I have 3 chapters. One is just a case study of an LA Times article about UCLA admissions. It turns out when I did this, I was an insider on UCLA admissions. I was a member of the Faculty Oversight Committee for admissions. One day, got my LA Times paper, read the article, and it kind of implied that UCLA was being racist and putting up obstacles in front of African American students. And I was outraged. I didn't think that was true, but then I read the article and said, well, what's false about it? And I couldn't find one false statement. And then in this case study, what I did is try to explain the part that I think that I was most outraged about was the statements that the journalists failed to report. And I give a list of series of facts I think should have been reported, or at least if there were facts that a conservative would have wanted you to learn. Maybe not so much facts a liberal might have wanted you to learn. Finally, next in chapter 7, I list 4 important stories, sort of topics that the mainstream media ignored. These are things like the Van Jones case, the self-avowed communist who was the green job czar in the Obama administration. And then finally, in chapter 8, I asked how do the political views of a journalist influence the stories that he or she decides to pursue. And the idea is I just follow a journalist around, interview her, and try to figure out why, it turns out she's a conservative, how her conservative views led her to do stories that I would argue that a conservative would want you to hear. And I try to argue that really you can't get around the views of a journalist, that the views of a journalist almost necessarily are going to influence at least the stories that they decide to pursue. And so let me give you a little more background details about that chapter 8. So it's all about Catherine Kirsten, who was a reporter at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. So here's how I report in my book. Turns out I'm quoting from the Rake magazine. So here it goes. When the tinny tinkle of Joy to the World, the Lord Has Come begins playing on the cell phone, everyone in range in the Star-Tribune newsroom knows who's getting a call. It's Catherine Kirsten, the paper's unapologetically religious and fiercely conservative Metro columnist. Since May 2005, the Star-Tribune has engaged in what its top editor freely describes as an experiment. The test has Catherine Kirsten, a 55-year-old former banker and think tank denizen, now an opinion writer, playing the role of an alien element injected into a tradition-bound newspaper culture. And so what I do is try to examine one of the stories she reported. This was, you may have remembered the flying imam story. A lot of people may not. These were imams, Muslim imams who boarded a plane from Minneapolis to Phoenix. Once they got on the plane, they started acting in lots of ways like the 9/11 terrorists. And eventually, some of the passengers reported them to the flight attendants, and they were taken off the plane. They were escorted off the plane and forced to go back home on a different airline. They sued the airline and the airport. They also sued the passengers, but no one was reporting that fact, that they were suing the passengers. And that I think was a very important fact, that no one else was reporting this. Catherine Kirsten discovered that, and that was her scoop. And so I talked to her, and I also tried to argue why I think that this story would have never been reported if Catherine Kirsten hadn't existed, and also wouldn't have been reported if Catherine Kirsten wasn't a conservative. So here's what I write. So before Kirsten wrote the Flying Imam story, several journalists had reported aspects of it. What they failed to note, however, was that the lawsuit targeted not just the airline, but the unnamed John Doe passengers on the flight. Many of the stories, said Kirsten, did little more than copy facts from the press release of the CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and an ally of the imams. With that story, said Kirsten, a typical reporter would investigate a little and say, nope, nothing more there. But I did some research on those guys, and there was one, Omar Shaheen, who had a very checkered background. When I researched him, it took so much time. I worked so many hours. Yeah, my conservative perspective definitely contributed. If you're not interested, if you don't see a story, you won't do it. To do those sort of things, you need to have a sort of antenna up, that there may be something fishy about those guys. Most reporters didn't have that antenna. So that's part 2, all about my distortion theory of bias. Finally, next, part 3, I want to describe some evidence of media bias. So here is what I think is the most important fact to know if you want to understand media bias. And this is that in a typical presidential election, Washington correspondents vote about 93-7 for the Democrat. And so I want to argue that I think, lots of people would say, we all knew the journalists vote overwhelmingly for the Democrat. But I'll argue this 93-7, that's not just a lot. That's, because lots of us would call 80-20 a lot, or 70-30 to a lot. And I want to argue this 93-7 is qualitatively different. It's qualitatively more than those 80-20 or 70-30. Here's a couple of ways to illustrate that. Turns out if you look at the 9th Congressional District, which contains Berkeley, California, that district only voted 90-10. So a Washington correspondents actually vote for the Democrats slightly more than Berkeley, California. The Massachusetts 8th Congressional District, which contains Cambridge, voted 86-14. So there, by my results, by these surveys, Cambridge, Massachusetts has about double the number of Republican voters than a typical Washington newsroom. Okay, here's one more illustration. So I just wanted to show, what would the opposite look like? Suppose we could look at the anti-newsroom, the mirror image of a newsroom. And so what I wanted to do is find a county in the U.S. that voted 93-7 for the Republican. And it turns out there is no such county except for King County, Texas, which only has 200 people. So not counting King County, Texas. There's only one which kind of come close and has a fair number of people, at least 100,000 people, and is within at least a day's drive of LA. I wanted to do a case study, so I wanted to be able to drive there. And that's Washington County, Utah. So this is in the very southwest corner of the state. St. George is the county seat, the great hiking country. Some of you may have been there. Very beautiful. Any of you saw High School Musical 2? Any of you have kids that are about 10? It was filmed there. You've seen the scenery if you saw that movie. But that county only voted 77-23 for McCain. So it's pretty conservative, but not quite as conservative as a newsroom. Okay, so I went there and I just wanted to interview some people. And one of the first persons I interviewed was, I wanted to interview, I was trying to find the most conservative person in the county. And so this is Tom Siegel. It turns out he's not the most conservative. He's pretty conservative. He owns a gun store in a very Mormon Republican area. And so he'll say, yeah, I'm pretty conservative. Once I met him, I really started admiring him, actually, and I wanted to think of a good name to describe him, and I think the best three-word phrase possible is American exceptionalism personified. And here's what I mean by that. First, American exceptionalism. This was coined by Alexis de Tocqueville in 1831, his book, Democracy in America. And his point was that America is qualitatively, it's fundamentally different from a lot of other economically advanced countries. For instance, we attend religious services more, we Americans. We have more kids. We have more friendly views toward capitalism. We're more entrepreneurial, and we own more guns. There's a lot of ways that we differ from, say, Europe. Tom Siegmiller is a devout Mormon, has 8 kids, and owns 2 successful businesses. One is the gun store. The other is an athletic supply store, which is this picture. Unfortunately, you can't quite see him. And the other is a gun store. You can't quite see in this picture, but if you look at the pictures just above him, the top one is a picture of Jesus. Next is some deer horns, buck horns that from a buck he killed while hunting. Next is a picture of George Washington, and down at the bottom is a plaque proclaiming him world's greatest dad. One of his kids gave that to him. So by the way, my own PQ, which is 13, I'm pretty conservative, and I usually agreed with Siegmiller on most things. But I wanted to kind of test him and see if I could get under his skin. So I asked a tough question. I said, isn't a gun more likely to kill a family member accidentally than to kill an intruder? Aren't you better off just using alarms and police for protection? And I did, kind of got a rise out of him. He said, now that's an absolute fallacy. In fact, that's almost a Hillary Clinton-like cliché. The people who say things like that have no knowledge about guns. It's as if you take someone with a kindergartner's knowledge, but for some reason you give him a podium. Okay, so next I wanted to find the most liberal person in that county. And for a strange reason, it was a strange gerrymandering. And for the Washington County, even though it's a very conservative county, it was actually represented by a Democrat named Jim Matheson. And so it turns out the lone congressional staff member for the Washington County office for Matheson was this guy, Mike Impey. And even though he's a Democrat, and I tried to find the most liberal person in the county, he's actually not that liberal. And here's a typical quote from him. My job is to show up at community and political functions and maintain a presence for Jim Matheson in Washington County. I try to convince people that we are not like the National Democratic Party. We're not extreme environmentalists. We're not rapid George Bush haters. And I try to explain to people that you can be a Mormon and still be a Democrat. So the main points of Chapter 11 is to say, in the mirror image of a newsroom, remember, it'd be one where conservatives would vote 93-7 for the Republican. People would vote 93-7 for the Republican. Views like Tom Siegmiller's, I would suggest, although maybe slightly more conservative than the average person, would still be within the mainstream. And views like Mike Impey's would be on the fringe, maybe even considered slightly odd in the mirror image of a newsroom. Okay, next. So far I've only talked about the views of journalists, what they feel in their heart, nothing about how they report. And so that's what I do now, is talk about, can I say, is their reporting actually liberal? It's one thing to say that their views are liberal. It's another to say that their reporting actually is. This begins with a peer-reviewed article that I wrote with Jeff Milo. My best friend is my best man at my wedding. He's now an economist at the University of Missouri. We wrote an article called A Measure of Media Bias, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. That article is 48 pages long. It's on my website, if anyone wants to see it, by timgrossclose.com. But I would urge you not to read the article. Instead, you can get the whole gist of the paper with just one page. And this is from Figure 2. And here's what I do. I want to now explain what I now call slant quotients. And so here's an example. I'm going to pick the New York Times. It's near the top. And if you look at the arrow from the New York Times, goes down here, comes to this point in the graph, go over, and it's about a 74 slant quotient, okay? Now, what that means, 74 slant quotient, is that, first recall that Joe Lieberman, you may have remembered from my PQs, Joe Lieberman had a 74 PQ. Joe Lieberman has a 74 political quotient, New York Times has a 74 slant quotient. That means that by my results, mine Milo's results, the average New York Times article sounds about as liberal as the average Joe Lieberman speech. Okay, that's what that 74 slant quotient means. Now, more specific, how do we do this? The main data we use are citations to think tanks. So what that means is that when the New York Times cited left-wing, right-wing, centrist think tanks, that it picked a mix that was approximately the mix that Joe Lieberman would pick when he would make speeches on the Senate floor. Okay, so that's what that means. So, and we could estimate a slant quotient for these 20 different news outlets. In my book, I talk about some other methods or other areas of data that someone could use to get other ways to estimate slant quotients. And one way was what I call the loaded phrase method. This was done by Genskow and Shapiro, who are two economists at the University of Chicago. When I say loaded phrases, this is an example would be something like death tax or estate tax. They're both describing the same thing, but which phrase you use gives away how you feel about that. So what they do is they find a bunch of these loaded phrases. They actually have a computer look through all the congressional speeches to try to find loaded phrases. And once they do that, they do a very similar technique that Milo and I did. And from that, you can estimate slant quotients. Another method that I used was facts about the Bush tax cuts, which journalists did or did not report. And there's one main fact, which liberals were often talking about, and this was that once the Bush tax cuts would be passed, the rich would receive a disproportionate share of the cuts. So you'd hear statements such as the top 1%, the wealthiest 1%, are going to get something like 30% of the benefits of these cuts. And that was all true. You could argue, maybe it was 28 or 32, but it was definitely disproportionate. I think everyone would agree. Meanwhile, conservatives were arguing a different fact, which I'd argue, which is equally true, and this was that the cuts made the income tax system more progressive. That actually, after the taxes were implemented, the rich would actually pay a greater share of the income taxes than before. Okay, so those were two facts. And one was one that conservatives wanted to hear, one was one that liberals wanted to hear, and I would use that to judge the slant quotients of media outlets. Okay, finally, to sum up this part 3, I do an estimate to try to say what is the average slant of the entire U.S. media. And so I get this survey, Gallup survey, that asks people where they got their news. So I sort of weighted slant quotients by the audience share of these different outlets, included everything, including talk radio, Fox News, everything. And by my estimate, the average slant quotient of the entire U.S. media is about 58.5. So remember, 50 is perfectly centrist, higher numbers are liberal, so I'm finding the average U.S. media has a bias to the left of about 8 points. Okay? Now, at the same time, by my method, says that the average Joe Lieberman speech has a leftward bias of about 24 points. So some people would say, well, Joe Lieberman's not that liberal, and so, I'm finding that the media is only 1/3 as biased as the average Joe Lieberman speech. So some people would say, oh, you didn't find that much evidence. But nevertheless, I would argue that at least I think, found convincing evidence that it is at least somewhat to the left of center. Okay, so that's the sum up of part 3. Part 4, now the effects of media bias. So it's one thing to say that the media are biased, another thing to say that it really matters. So I review some academic literature which suggests that these effects are large. And so I look at 3 cases, all 3 cases I'm aware of where social scientists have done either a real experiment or something like an experiment to test the effect of the media. And so here's an example. 3 guys at Yale, Alan Gerber, Carlin and Berger, I can't remember the first names for them at the moment, they did what they call a field experiment. They actually went to Northern Virginia, suburbs of Washington, D.C., looked for people who had not subscribed to the Washington Post or Washington Times. They got the list from the Times and Post, called them up, and then just before calling them up, they would flip a coin. And if it was heads, I would say, hey, we're going to offer you a free subscription to the Washington Post. If it's tails, say, we're going to offer you a free subscription to the Washington Times. So this is like what biologists do when they have a control group and a treatment group. So any effect they find, we can say, this is really causal. And sure enough, they found an effect. They found that the Post group indeed voted for the Democrat. It was a governor's race in 2005. There was an election during the time they had this trial subscription, and then the researchers called the subjects, the subscribers up right after the election and say, who'd you vote for? And the Post group voted for the Democrat at about 3.8 percentage point higher than the Times group did. There's another experiment, a natural experiment, Della Vigna and Kaplan looked where Fox News located in the late 90s. They argued that really Fox News couldn't pick and choose its markets according to political views, so it was something like an experiment. Given all that, and they found significant effects too, that they found Fox News actually caused people to vote more conservatively in the late 90s. Now, if that is true, and you believe all of my results so far, that 50 is centrist, 58.5 is the average slant, and the media really can affect how people think and vote, this means that this 50.4, that's the views we observe in the average voter, that those views are artificial. That if the media really has an effect, they've pulled the voters at least somewhat to the left. And so the natural views of those voters, if it weren't for media bias, is somewhere over here. Questions we don't know where, and I said, well, let's call it X. Okay, now from there, I put in a mathematical model. Now in this book, I try to keep any math to the side. There's only one chapter that even has an equation, and this equation I use a little bit of algebra. First, the model is that this Y, it is there's sort of two forces pulling on it. The media is pulling the average voter this way. Meanwhile, the average voter's natural views are pulling him or her that way. So there's this tug of war, and I'm saying this 50 is kind of the result of the equilibrium of that. So from there, I use those academic studies to try to estimate what is this lambda, and this lambda is the weight I'm putting on the media's views. And by the way, lambda also represents that distance as a proportion of that distance. And so by my estimate, that lambda is about 0.7. From that, I know what Y is, lambda is, and what S is. It's just an algebra problem, and then I can estimate what X is. Okay? From there, I estimate that X is 31.5. That's my estimate of what the average voter's PQ would be if it weren't for media bias. And so X is somewhere over here, 31.5. Then I argue in the book also that I've made some assumptions that I think err on the side of making X higher than it really is. I think maybe more likely X is something like 25 or 30. Trust me, I can tell you there's a lot of assumptions built in. I think all of them are reasonable, but nevertheless, I should be upfront about that. But once I get that, I say, here's how I can conclude the book. It's to say, 25 or 30, that's what those natural views would be. So the question I can ask is, currently, America thinks and votes about like the average purple state, something like a Nevada, Iowa, or Colorado. The question I ask, what if you could remove the effects of the media? You could remove media bias or, alternatively, remove its effects. If you did that, how would America think and vote? And my answer is approximately like Texas, or approximately like North Dakota or Virginia. Okay, and with that, I will end and take your questions.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. Folks know the drill. If anybody would like to ask a question, please go to the back of the room, and we will take questions in a second. looking out at this crowd, I suspect they all have their slide rules with them. So if you want to give them an exam, I think that's fine. I think they'll be ready for it.
Yeah, the second exam.
And I'll ask you the first question while folks are lining up. I'd be curious to know, you talked a lot about reporters, and you spent a lot of time, and I know you spent a lot of time in your book talking about the bias among reporters. Is that offset or reinforced by editorial supervision, ownership, the influence of advertising? What is the effect of all these other factors that go into the final product? Does it simply reinforce your findings? Does it cut the other way? Is it different for liberals and conservatives? It's a long walk back, so I had to ask a very complicated question.
Let's see. I'm not sure if I can answer all of it entirely, but I want to say that I agree with you. I think, and generally, if you look at these surveys, and you ask, like, how do publishers vote? How do the owners of the newsroom vote? And they are more conservative. The owners maybe even be right-leaning. Publishers and editors are pretty moderate, actually, the way they vote. And so, meanwhile, the journalists vote about 93.7 in the newsroom. So what I like to think about, they vote 93.7. Meanwhile, Berkeley, California votes about the same way. So Berkeley, California has elected Barbara Lee to Congress, whose PQ is 100, maybe 105 or so. She's pretty darn liberal. So my argument is if you could take the average views of Washington correspondents, or kind of the median views, I think they would be about something like Barbara Lee's if they could vote for a representative. So if that's all true, that means that if Washington correspondents didn't temper their views at all, they just reported the way they felt in their heart, their slant quotients would be something like 100. Okay, and I'm not finding that at all. In fact, so this 58.5, that I should say, that includes things like Fox News and talk radio. If you just put in the average of all the mainstream news outlets, take out talk radio, Fox News, you get something like 63 or something is what the average slant of the mainstream media. So by my findings, if all that is right, everything I've just suggested, that means, meanwhile, while journalists are thinking out here, they temper their own views and they report like here. They move toward the center. Now, not all the way toward the center. By my estimate, they only move something like 2/3 toward the center. And so the question is, what is pulling them toward the center? And I think there's a lot of things. One, there's norms in journalism to report both sides of an issue, even if you vehemently disagree with one side of the issue. And I think Brian is right that it's got to be, I'm sure, publishers and editors, and especially owners who are wanting to think, let's maximize profits, let's report in such a way, kind of like our average consumer, which would be something like a 50. And so I think lots of those things are pulling reporters reporting toward the center, but at least my results say it doesn't quite go all the way toward the center, but it makes a significant movement in that direction.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
Let me ask you a question about the homework. If the group in here did the homework, you would get a high correlation to their real views. If politicians do the homework, like Charlie Wilson may be supporting it because Julia Roberts told him, or whatever.
Exactly.
How do we account for that difference?
Well, okay. When I say the PQ of these politicians, I should say not necessarily what they feel in their heart, but the way economists sometimes call it induced preferences. These are their preferences induced by their own heart, by also their constituents, possibly lobbyists, lots of other, their party. I should say there's an excellent paper by Steve Levitt, turns out. Wrote this in American Economic Review. It found out, so what's the weight that politicians place on things like their own views, their constituents, and he found it's something like 65 or 70% their own heart. But a big part of its constituents, big part of its their party, and so on. So when I report the PQ, I mean the latter, the thing that's the weighted average of all those factors. And so I'm assuming, though, that when they're making speeches, that they're making speeches with those same forces impacting on them. So that the same, when they make a speech, that they're thinking also about constituents and party and so on. I hope, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was interested in maybe whether you have some historical data to compare this with, because obviously the rise of talk radio in the 80s and then Fox News in the late 90s, and you just mentioned then that if you take Fox and talk radio out, you get a difference in how far, well, in the average, and also presumably how far the basic voter is being pulled. And so I just wondered, do you have data for earlier periods, and can you show if there's been sort of a moderating effect from those news sources coming into the environment?
It's an excellent question, and the short answer is no. This took 8 years to write this book. At some point, my wife is, I'm calling it my manifesto to my wife, and with each of those 20 news outlets, it took about a month or two just to get the data for that. So that's my excuse for not doing that. But that said, in some ways it is historical. All of the data actually was from the early 2000s. There's very little after 2005. And let me say my own hunch is that things have probably moved a little right in the media from what I report. I think talk radio has gotten more audience. Basically, no one had heard of Rush Limbaugh before 1992. I mean, basically, Bill Clinton made Rush Limbaugh, and I argue Rush Limbaugh helped all these other talk radio hosts. So talk radio was just a blip before 92. So that's been growing. And then also Fox News was only available to something like 20% of the viewers before like 2000 or something. It's only after kind of the early 2000s that Fox News started growing. And when I did all this research, I'd argue that Fox News was probably not as conservative as it is now. So for instance, now we have a Hannity show. When I did all my research, Hannity was on the Hannity and Combs show. And it's just casual observation, but people like Greta Van Susteren, I think, has moved a little bit to the right, at least since 2008. So that 58.5, I would argue, may have moved a point or two or three to the right since I've done my research.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm 86 years old, and I'm trying to catch up with you. I was wondering the relationship between PQ, SQ, and IQ. And I'm very impressed if you look at the voting records all over the United States for my 80-some years, wherever you get to a university community and you assume that the IQs are higher there, they vote Democratic. All over and you go to India or Korea and China, where I've been, the same thing is true. The more intelligent are more liberal.
Excellent point. I might add one little caveat to that. You actually, if you look at education, if you look at education on the x-axis and how much education a person has. So how many years of schooling, for instance. It's kind of U-shaped, actually. So it turns out the most liberals, the people who have the most education, who have a doctorate, are indeed very, very liberal. But it's also true that the people without a high school education are also very, very liberal. And what you get is the people who have, just gotten only a college education or just some college, they tend to be the most conservative of those voters. So it's kind of U-shaped. It is an excellent point, and some people have criticized my think tank method for that. They say, look, what's going on is that these liberal think tanks are just smarter and better than the conservative think tanks. And I address that in my book. I'd argue what's important is not whether that's true in general. What's important is whether that's true in my sample of think tanks. And I think that in my sample of 200 think tanks that, if anything, the conservative think tank might have been more scholarly than the sample of liberal think tanks. I had things like the Hoover Institution, American Enterprise Institute. So, but regardless, that's an empirical question. It may be true, and it could distort my findings. It could cause me to find an artificial amount of, to make the media look artificially more liberal than they are, but it could also make them artificially look more conservative than they are, but it's an empirical question. And my only response is that that's why it's important to look at these other two methods that I did. So, for instance, the loaded phrase method, I don't think that factor is as important. You know, so whether you cite a think tank, you may look to see how smart they are, but whether it's which phrase you use, there's nothing like an IQ of a phrase, I would argue. And the same thing with these facts, the facts about the Bush tax cuts. You know, both were true, and so I'd argue that was almost a pure case of just ideology, which you would pick. But I'd argue it's an excellent point. It's an empirical question, which way the bias could go, and but I'd argue that's why it's important to read those other two chapters.
Thank you. That was awfully interesting, and it raises more questions, perhaps, than it gives answers. So let me toss some at you. A few slides from the end, you had a listing of media outlets where from the most liberal on the top to the most conservative on the bottom. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there it is. I was stunned to see the Wall Street Journal at the top. Anybody who knows the Wall Street Journal will know that certainly doesn't apply to its editorial pages and its op-eds. So first question is, are you distorting this by not looking at the editorial pages, that which is genuinely opinion? Second question, in terms of what's the dependent variable and what's the independent variable, your argument is that a bias of the media pushes individual consumers of media in a conservative or liberal direction. But as many people have suggested, consumers of media don't just have stuff dumped on them from the heavens. They choose which media sources they're going to view. And so one might expect that if a certain media source doesn't suit perhaps their preconceptions, perhaps their judgments based on careful reading, they have lots of other alternatives to look at. And along with that, your three examples trying to show some causation in this regard seem to me, look, I know this is difficult to do, they seem to be awfully weak. The one of the people who get the Washington Times versus Washington Post. The most striking fact about that is that beforehand they're getting neither. Something is being pushed at them, and you see some difference between the groups. Now, I don't know what the numbers are involved in this. I suspect not real high, and I suspect the statistical significance fairly low. The other one, in terms of the effect of the appearance of Fox News, that one seems to me even weaker. I don't want to go into discussing methodology with you. What could be more boring than that? But perhaps you could say something about how you respond to the kind of critics that I'm sure you get along these lines. Thank you.
Excellent. I think all excellent points, I have to say. Even I think some of those were a little hostile to it, but I want to say excellent. And first, I want to agree with you that you said the last part of the book, my estimates of the effects of the media seem to be a little weak. And I'd argue that that's true. I think that's the weakest part of my argument in this entire book. And actually, I'm almost angry at some of these liberal blogs that have attacked me, and they've attacked me for other stuff. I almost suspect they didn't read the book, because I want to tell them, no, if you think that's bad, hey, I've got worse parts, that last part, and they're not mentioning it. So I want to thank you for catching it. Even friends of mine have mentioned that. In my defense, even though that's weak, one defense is that I'm only aware of these 3 studies. It's very hard. I think one, you have to do something like an experiment. For that point you mentioned about you can select your own media, right? So there's all kinds of studies in political science where people will do something like they'll poll people and ask, did you watch Fox News or not? What news do you? And they'll find that Fox News watchers have these views. And they're saying they must have been caused by Fox News. And I said, no, that's not it. What's going on, the conservatives self-select to watch Fox News, and it's not necessarily causal. We social scientists sometimes call it an endogeneity problem. And to get around an endogeneity problem, this selection problem, you have to do something like an experiment. And I'd argue, I think that the media research field in general within social science is pretty weak. I think it's weaker than a lot of other fields. And I think it's only recently that some bright scholars have said, you know, we can do some experiments. And so one is that Fox News effect. Now, they found, I'd say, a pretty small, you could argue a small effect of Fox News. It was statistically significant, their original paper. I'd say just barely. Now, you could argue to get more statistical significance, they need to get a bigger sample size where they were limited. They can only use the data that they have. The other study, this one by the Yale researchers, again, that 3.8 percentage point, turns out that was not statistically significant in their original paper. It was not. And I'm friends with the lead author, Alan Gerber. And, you know, I'd love to tell him, you know, look, the problem with your study is you just didn't have a big enough sample size. Now, in his defense, though, remember, they are buying subscriptions for these people, okay? So they had a sample size of 600 Washington Post people, 600 Washington Times. This is about $20 a subscription of their own money. Well, they had a research grant, but still, that's a lot of money. And I think one thing that my research shows is like, look, if you believe my media lambda is about 0.7, what would have been the size they would have needed to get statistical significance? It's well over 10,000. So, you know, I hate to tell them you need that, but when they're paying the subscriptions. Let's see, I want to go backwards. I think I covered a couple questions. And just the other thing, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal, and I'm glad you mentioned that. In the book, I've actually got a little asterisk by the Wall Street Journal. It says news pages only. And you're right, anyone who reads it, I think I would argue that the editorial pages have got to have a SQ of something like 15. It sounds about like the middle of the Republican Party. Maybe every once in a while they have a Democrat in there. But when the SQ that I have is only for their news pages, even then I was a little surprised. And it may be an artifact of the period I looked at. I've looked at other periods, kind of done a pilot sample. It looks like Wall Street Journal is only, the news pages is only about as liberal as the New York Times. Also, all this data comes from before Murdoch, okay? And so the other question, why not include the editorial pages? Partly the think tank method, it just didn't work very well. I looked at some of this. What happens with editorials is often the editorial writer will cite a think tank, often the other side, and sometimes will be sarcastic about the other side. Now, I had lots of freshman and sophomore research assistants, and often they didn't catch the sarcasm, and I was getting some weird results, you know, some obviously conservative opinion pays. We're looking centrist or liberal, and I decided I don't think that method, the think tank method, is good for analyzing the editorial pages. For most of the newspapers, that wouldn't be a problem because their editorial page is kind of similar to the news pages, at least has the same direction. But definitely, the Wall Street Journal, that would be a problem. And so, once again, I want to say good points on all those cases.
Tim, we have time for one more question.
Thanks very much. I may have missed this, but I was wondering first if you could go back through and just explain how you're theorizing the magnitude of the media's effect on somebody, I guess, in a vacuum, what the media does, and if you're getting that, regardless of that 50%, regardless of whatever the media number is, how are you estimating the percentage of the pull of media relative to other things in somebody's life? And the more general question, I guess, is how are you even able to conceptualize what a person's ideology is in a vacuum, so that what you estimated to be around 34 or 30 something, because it's certainly convincing for you to say, let's say you're right about everything here. It's certainly convincing to say, look, the media is pulling you this much in this direction, but I would say, and so if we didn't have the media as it was today, we wouldn't have this poll. Everyone would be around 34. And I'd say, hey, if we didn't have the Catholic Church, everybody would be So I'm going to write a book called Right Turn. It's about how Christianity pulls us all, rightward or something. So, but the point is, we're not born with an ideology. It's not like gender. We don't pop out and someone says, "Oh, it's a Republican" or something. So these things are informed by a lot of different things in our surroundings. And so I'm just wondering how you're even able to conceptualize that to put into an abstract model in the first place. Thank you.
And you can tell Kyle is a political scientist, not a historian, because he thinks we're born with gender.
Let's see. It takes a long response. I'll begin with a joke that, if I can. There's a chemist, physicist, and economist on a deserted island. They find this can of beans, and they say, well, we got to open it. How do we get this open? And the physicist says, well, look, we can go up on this tall tree, and I can drop it at this exact height, and it will open. Once it hits the ground. And the chemist says, I've got a better idea. It said, we've got the chemicals inside the can of beans, and if we heat it just the right amount, it will cause the top to pop open. And the economist says, I think I have a better idea. And he says, what's that? And he says, well, first of all, assume we have a can opener. Okay. So to make all those deductions that I have to say, first, I have to make some assumptions. And one is that I'm saying the world looks like that equation, which I think is pretty reasonable. It's about the simplest model I can think of, but it is a model. There's some assumptions. There's a linearity assumption involved in this, that the lambda is constant no matter where. So there's lots of things built into that, but I think all pretty reasonable. From that, I can get X. So that X is a very abstract notion, but I said, look, maybe we can observe Y and we can estimate lambda and S. From that, I do an algebra problem to get X. But it takes, to get that, some maintained assumptions. So I can see why people might be skeptical. You ask, how can I estimate lambda? The key is that if you've studied calculus, it turns out there's a derivative. You can take a derivative of Y with respect to S, and it turns out, so that means is how does Y change when you make S change just a little bit? And the answer by this equation, Newton gave us all this technology, is lambda. And so I use that to say, well, look, we have all these experiments where they have altered S in a small way. So you put Fox News into an area, and this is in the late 90s where it didn't compose that much of people's viewing. You go to those Washington, D.C. suburbs, you give them the subscription, Washington Times, Washington Post. I'd argue that there's lots and lots of media outlets out there that it really didn't change the total slant of people's news by that much. And so what I did is I looked at how their PQs changed divided by how that slant changed, and that's my estimate of lambda. So that's a very technical answer, but if you're willing to assume can openers, I'd argue those assumptions are reasonable.
Well, Tim, I want to thank you for opening this can of worms and for shedding a great deal of light on it. And of course, we won't have media bias if there is no media, and you have actually suggested the solution to funding the media in the future. That's researchers buying subscriptions to the Washington Post.
Right.
Tim will be signing books right afterwards, and please give him a round of applause for a very good talk.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all.